Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on one of the most opulent, over-the-top, and quietly absurd chapters of American history, the Grand Hotel of the 1920s. Marble staircases, gold-trimmed elevators, orchestras playing until midnight, and an army of staff whose only purpose was to make sure you never had to lift a single finger. It looked like paradise, and for a few glittering years, it very nearly was. Before we drift off together, a quick thank you to everyone who leaves comments and suggestions. This channel exists because of you, and every idea you share genuinely shapes what we cover next. If you're new here, feel free to settle in, get comfortable, and let this story carry you off to sleep. No need to catch every word. Just let the voice wash over you like a warm bath after a long train ride. Now dim the lights, get your blanket just right, and let's step back exactly 100 years into the marble lobby of a grand American hotel in the golden, gaudy, slightly ridiculous year of 1925. Picture it. You've just stepped off a long, rattling train, dust on your coat, your collar wilted from hours of travel, and a heavy trunk dragging at your arm. Ahead of you rises a building that looks less like a hotel and more like a monument, stone columns, a glass canopy stretching over the entrance, and windows glowing gold even in the middle of the afternoon. This is not simply a place to sleep. This is a stage, and you are about to become, however briefly, one of its characters. A taxi rolls to the curb, and before the wheels have even settled, a man in a long coat with buttons like small suns has already reached for the door. This is the hotel's doorman, and he has one job that somehow contains 1,000 smaller jobs inside it. He welcomes you as though you are the single most important arrival of his entire week, even though you are, in reality, guest number 40 of the day. He remembers faces. He remembers names. He remembers, with an almost unsettling precision, exactly who tipped generously last season and who suddenly developed trouble finding loose change. Watch him for a moment before you go inside, because there's more craft to this than people usually give credit for. He stands outside in blazing summer heat and biting winter wind, in rain that soaks through wool coats and snow that turns the sidewalk to ice, and every single time those doors swing open, his face does the same thing. Pleasant, attentive, entirely present. In a strange sense, he is the memory of the whole building, standing watch at its threshold, cataloging everyone who comes and goes. His uniform is doing quite a lot of work, too. The stiff-brimmed cap, the double row of brass buttons, the long coat that makes him look roughly twice as important as an ordinary man in trousers. All of it exists to tell you, before you've said a single word, that you have arrived somewhere that takes itself very seriously indeed. It's the 1920s version of a glowing sign above the entrance, except the sign can also hail a cab, comment on the weather, and quietly judge your luggage. And speaking of that weather, much of his real job happens at the curb, not the door. A steady stream of automobiles, delivery trucks, and hired cars all want the exact same 6 feet of pavement at the exact same moment, and he manages the whole small chaos with the calm of a conductor in front of an orchestra. Wave this car forward. Hold that one back. Somehow nothing collides, and somehow nobody driving away even realizes how close they came to a very embarrassing dent. Then there's your luggage, which in this era is a serious undertaking all its own. You are not traveling with a wheeled carry-on and a slim laptop bag. You've brought a steamer trunk built like a small piece of furniture, several hat boxes, and a leather suitcase heavy enough that carrying it up a single flight of stairs would leave you winded. The doorman does not touch any of it personally. That would be beneath the dignity of his post. Instead, with a small practiced nod, he summons a bellhop, and your entire traveling household disappears from your hands before you've fully processed that it's gone. And hidden inside this warm welcome is a small, unspoken test. Somewhere in these first few seconds, you're expected to press a folded bill discreetly into his palm, as if money were a faintly embarrassing thing that occasionally, accidentally, falls out of your hand near hotel employees. Too obvious, and you look like someone who has never stayed anywhere fancier than a roadside inn. Too stingy, and you've just made a quiet enemy at the one door you'll be walking through every single day of your visit. Trying to make a graceful first impression while doing rapid arithmetic in your coat pocket is its own peculiar skill, and every traveler of this era had to learn it fast. You manage it. You smile, you nod, something passes discreetly from your hand to his, and he tips his cap as though you've just done him a personal favor. The great doors part. You step through them, and you have not yet spent a single minute inside the building. The lobby hits you like stepping into warm bathwater. Marble floors stretch in every direction, polished to a shine you could genuinely check your reflection in. Chandeliers hang from a ceiling 3 stories above your head, dripping crystal. Potted palms lean gently over deep leather armchairs, and somewhere, entirely unnecessarily, a fountain trickles quietly, existing purely to remind you that this establishment has money to spend on decorative water. Voices murmur. A newspaper rustles somewhere to your left. The whole room smells faintly of cigar smoke, fresh flowers, and floor wax. It isn't really a room so much as a performance, and you have just wandered onto its stage without an invitation. Let your eyes drift upward, because that's precisely what the architects intended when they designed it. These ceilings soar far higher than any lobby actually requires, because nothing announces wealth quite like paying to heat and illuminate an enormous volume of completely empty air above your guests' heads. Gilded moldings trace the edges of the ceiling. Painted murals sometimes stretch clear across it. The whole effect is engineered to make you feel small in the most flattering possible way. A cathedral built not to any god in particular, but to the idea of money itself. Now look at the people, because the lobby is really built as a stage for them too. Society women in fur-trimmed coats glide past like slow-moving ships. Businessmen cluster near the marble columns, striking deals in voices pitched just low enough to seem important. A young couple sits stiffly on a settee, pretending not to worry about the bill that's coming. Everyone here is performing just slightly. Aware on some level that they are being watched, which is exactly why the armchairs happen to be arranged for maximum visibility. Nobody in a grand lobby simply sat. They held court. The palms deserve their own moment of attention. Grand hotels of this era were positively obsessed with potted greenery, arranging ferns and small trees into miniature indoor jungles that gave the whole space a lush, faintly tropical feeling, entirely unrelated to whatever climate existed outside the windows. Some of the largest hotels went further still, building glass-roofed courts specifically to house their greenery, where a small orchestra might play in the afternoon while guests sipped tea among the leaves. It was decoration purely for the sake of decoration, a way of saying, we have so much space and so much money that we grow trees indoors simply because we can. Underfoot, that marble is doing its own quiet work. Cool, hard, and relentlessly polished, it announces every footstep with a small crisp click, so the whole room seems to move around you like a gentle, unhurried percussion section. It also means that a single spilled drink can turn a section of floor into an ice rink without warning, which is why somewhere, always, a member of staff is watching for exactly that. All of that shine came at a price paid nightly, in the form of a small army of workers buffing the floors back to a mirror finish, long after the last guest had gone up to bed. And then there's the sound of the place, or rather its particular quality of hush. A grand lobby was never truly silent, but it was disciplined. Voices stayed low. Laughter stayed polite and brief. Often the loudest sound in the entire room was that decorative fountain, trickling along with the smug confidence of water that knows its entire purpose is simply to be pleasant. It's the distant ancestor of every soft instrumental track piped through hotel lobbies today, background noise engineered specifically for calm. The whole space really has one job, and it does that job brilliantly, to make you feel, if only for a moment, that you've stepped clean out of your ordinary life and into something considerably finer. Whether you're a genuine millionaire or a traveling salesman who saved for 8 months for this one trip, the lobby offers you exactly the same dazzling first impression. It's generous in that particular way, right up until you reach the front desk, where the generosity becomes noticeably more selective. Now it's time to actually announce yourself, which means crossing the marble floor to the front desk. A long, polished counter guarded by a clerk with immaculate hair and the unshakable calm of a man who has seen every possible category of traveler pass through his lobby. You sign the register, an enormous leather-bound book where your name joins a long parade of salesmen, honeymooners, minor celebrities, and the occasional genuine scandal waiting to happen. He glances once at your luggage, quietly forms an opinion about you that he will never voice aloud, and slides a heavy brass key across the counter toward you. Congratulations! You now have a room and a permanent, invisible audience. The room clerk is a very specific kind of professional, smooth, unflappable, impossibly polite, and quietly merciless in his assessments. In a single glance he takes in your clothing, your luggage, your accent, your general bearing, and from all of that assembles a rapid, silent judgment about precisely what kind of guest you're about to be. He would never say any of this out loud. He doesn't need to. It's written plainly enough in which room he happens to assign you. That register is more than a formality, too. It's part record, part status symbol, and part endless source of gossip. Curious guests and the occasional sharp-eyed reporter would sometimes crane their necks to see who else had signed in that week, hopping to spot a famous name or an unusual pairing of names that didn't quite belong together. Signing the book was a small ceremony, your formal entry into the temporary society of the hotel. It also meant that from that exact moment forward, the establishment knew precisely who you were, which felt reassuring and just faintly unsettling in equal measure. Then comes the key itself, and it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the flimsy plastic card you're used to today. This is a substantial piece of brass, usually attached to a heavy tag or fob, deliberately weighted so you'd think twice before absent-mindedly slipping it into your coat pocket and walking off with it. You did not carry this key around the city with you. You handed it back to the desk each time you left the building and collected it again on your return, which meant the front desk always had a fairly precise sense of whether you were currently in the hotel or out in the world. It was security, inventory, and gentle surveillance, all bundled into one heavy piece of metal. The clerk himself sits at the center of an entire information network. He knows who has checked in and who has checked out. He knows which guests are expecting visitors and which visitors are decidedly not expected. He fields questions about train schedules, theater tickets, restaurant recommendations, and the weather, all delivered with precisely the same unbothered calm. He is, in every meaningful sense, the search engine of 1925, except this one silently judges you and remembers everything forever. Beneath the polished surface, a quiet hierarchy is always at work. A well-dressed regular arriving with fine luggage might glide through check-in in under a minute and float upward to a suite with a proper view. A weary traveler in a rumpled coat might find himself politely steered toward a smaller room near the elevator shaft, the one that rattles faintly all night long. Nothing rude is ever said. The system simply, quietly, sorts you into your place. So you take your enormous brass key, offer your thanks, and turn toward the elevators, feeling simultaneously welcomed and thoroughly assessed. You have a room. You have a number. You've joined the temporary population of a small, glittering kingdom, and the very next member of its staff is already waiting to take your bags, because in a place like this, you are never permitted to be alone with your own luggage for very long. Before you can even reach for your own suitcase, a young man in a tight-fitted uniform and a small round cap has already scooped it up. This is the bellhop, and he moves with a speed and cheerfulness that suggests he has done this exact task several thousand times already this month, which he probably has. He guides you toward the elevator bank, carrying what feels like half your worldly possessions as though it weighs nothing at all, chatting just enough to be pleasant without ever tipping into annoying. In an age long before wheeled suitcases existed, his back is doing genuinely heroic, uncelebrated work. Consider that luggage for a moment, purely out of sympathy for him. This is the era of the steamer trunk, a great wooden and leather beast built to survive ocean crossings and cross-country rail journeys, packed with enough clothing for weeks away from home. Add in the suitcases, the hat boxes, and the occasional set of golf clubs, and the bellhop is essentially hauling a small household across acres of marble floor. There are no wheels to help him. There is no clever folding handle. There is only him, a luggage cart if he's lucky, and the stubborn determination of youth. The little round cap and snug jacket aren't accidental, either. The bellhop was meant to look crisp, eager, and unmistakably part of the hotel, a bright uniformed figure darting through the grand public spaces like a well-trained messenger bird. The look became so recognizable that it turned into a kind of cultural shorthand all its own, the cheerful young man in the round hat, calling out a guest's name across a crowded lobby. It's an image so iconic that people still picture it instantly today, long after the job itself has mostly vanished. His usefulness reaches well beyond carrying bags, too. A good bellhop functioned as a walking guidebook, a fixer, and a quietly discreet problem solver rolled into one. Need to know the best place nearby for a decent meal, a reliable barber, a theater with good seats left. Ask the bellhop. Need something delivered, fetched, or arranged with absolutely no questions asked. The bellhop again. During Prohibition, this particular talent would take on an especially interesting flavor, but we'll get to that thirsty little subject a bit later tonight. The whole relationship between you and the bellhop runs on a delicate, unspoken economy of tips. Every bag carried, every errand completed, every helpful suggestion offered comes wrapped in the quiet understanding that a small coin will follow. He never actually asks. He simply lingers just slightly, in that particular practiced pause that signals the moment has arrived. It's the same subtle hover you might recognize today whenever a helpful stranger has clearly done you a favor and is now waiting politely to see whether you've noticed. He always notices whether you noticed. For the young men who took these jobs, the work was hard, physical, and nearly endless, but it could also be surprisingly lucrative. A quick, charming, well-liked bellhop at a busy hotel could earn considerably more in tips than his official wage would ever suggest. He learned to read people almost instantly, to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud, and to keep a running mental map of who was staying where and who wanted what. It was a hustle in the truest sense, and the best of them were remarkably good at it. So he leads you across the lobby, your enormous burden balanced with an ease that seems almost unfair, chatting lightly about your journey while steering you exactly where you need to go. You feel looked after. You feel, for just a moment, important. And you have quietly agreed, without a single spoken word, to a running tab of gratitude that will follow you all the way to the elevator, where yet another smiling stranger is already waiting to take over your care. You step into the elevator, and here you meet yet another professional whose entire career might genuinely surprise you, the elevator operator. He sits perched on a small stool beside a polished brass lever, greets you warmly, asks which floor you need, and then guides the car upward with the practiced touch of someone who repeats this exact motion several hundred times a day. There are no buttons to press, no glowing numbers to poke at impatiently. You simply stand there in your travel clothes, making pleasant small talk, while a total stranger gently transports you vertically through a very expensive building. The machine he operates is genuinely tricky to run, which is precisely why it needs a skilled human hand at all. Early elevators didn't glide smoothly to a stop and level themselves automatically. The operator had to ease the car to a halt manually, judging the movement carefully so the elevator floor lined up neatly with the hallway floor outside. Get it right, and you step out without a second thought. Get it wrong, and there's a little jolt, a mismatched step, and the mild indignity of stumbling out in front of strangers. A truly skilled operator made the whole thing look effortless, which is usually the surest sign that it wasn't. He's also, whether he means to be or not, something of a keeper of secrets. All day long he carries guests up and down, overhearing scraps of conversation, noticing who's headed to whose floor, quietly observing the small dramas of the building as they unfold across the space of a short ride. He says nothing, of course. Discretion is half the job description. But if the walls of a grand hotel could talk, the elevator operator would likely be the one they'd quote first, since he heard most of it before anyone else, standing quietly by his brass lever with a pleasant, unreadable expression fixed in place. The cramped space makes for its own peculiar little social ritual, too. You're confined in a small, elegant box with a stranger for anywhere between a few seconds and a full minute, and etiquette demands a certain polite exchange, a comment on the weather, a remark about the size of the crowd downstairs, a wish for a pleasant evening. It's the same awkward small talk of a modern elevator ride, except back then, there happened to be a professional standing right there to help carry the conversation along, which, honestly, might have been a genuine improvement. His uniform, like everyone else's in this building, is doing its share of the performance. Neatly pressed, often finished with white gloves, he's meant to look sharp and reassuring, a calm, steady presence in charge of a machine that still struck plenty of guests as faintly alarming. For many travelers, especially those who'd grown up navigating nothing more mechanical than a staircase, the elevator itself remained a genuine marvel, a smooth mechanical climb through the heart of a towering building. Having a poised attendant at the controls made the whole experience feel less like operating a contraption and more like being personally lifted toward luxury. There's a gentle absurdity to it when you really stop and think it through. An entire human career built around the single task of moving people up and down inside a building. It sounds almost quaint now, in a world where you simply tap a glowing button and ride alone in silence, carefully avoiding eye contact with your own reflection. But in the 1920s, this was service, and service meant a real person handled the task so that you never had to think about it at all. Even climbing a flight of stairs had, in a sense, been quietly done for you. So he eases the car to a gentle stop, slides the gate open with a small flourish, and announces your floor as though it were a destination worth celebrating in its own right. You step out onto plush carpet, the bellhop close behind with your bags, and the operator tips his head politely before descending again to collect his next passenger. Your room is close now, and remarkably, you still haven't carried a single item yourself. The door swings open, and there it is, your room, or if you're feeling especially flush, your suite. Heavy drapes frame tall windows. A plush bed sits solidly against the far wall. The furniture is dark, heavy, and clearly built to outlast you by several decades. There might be a writing desk stocked with crisp hotel stationery, a comfortable armchair angled just so, and a pair of electric lamps waiting patiently to impress you. Everything smells faintly of clean linen and furniture polish. The bellhop shows you around, points out a few small features, and then hovers just slightly. Because this, of course, is precisely the moment you're expected to tip him. Let's talk about that furniture for a moment, because it bears no resemblance whatsoever to the light, flat-packed pieces you might know today. This is heavy, serious craftsmanship, built from solid wood and meant to survive decades of guests treating it exactly as carelessly as guests always eventually do. The wardrobe is enormous, because your steamer trunk needs somewhere proper to unpack into. The bed frame is sturdy enough to anchor a small ship. Everything carries real weight and permanence, the quiet confidence of an object that fully expects to still be standing there long after you've checked out and been entirely forgotten. The writing desk deserves a little extra affection. Stocked with the hotel's own stationery, its name printed proudly across the top of every sheet, it practically invited you to write letters home and casually mention exactly where you were staying. It was free advertising disguised neatly as a courtesy, and it worked beautifully. There's something quietly charming about an age when the height of luxury communication was simply a fine sheet of paper, a good pen, and the calm certainty that your letter would take several days to arrive, and nobody minded that in the least. Look a little closer, and you'll find the small touches that separated a genuinely grand hotel from a mere place to sleep. Fresh flowers in a vase, a bowl of fruit if your room was among the pricier ones, thick curtains that actually blocked out the light, a real luxury in a noisy, brightly lit city, a telephone sitting on the desk, a marvel we'll properly admire in just a moment. Each small detail was designed to make you feel personally cared for, as though the hotel had been expecting you specifically, and gone to some particular trouble on your behalf. Then there's the view, which was very much baked into the price. A room overlooking the avenue, the park, or the harbor cost considerably more than one facing a brick wall or humming quietly beside the elevator shaft. And remember, the clerk downstairs decided which one you got, based on that swift, silent judgment made back at the front desk. So if you find yourself gazing out over a glittering city skyline, congratulations, you passed the test. And if you're staring at an air shaft instead, well, at least the bed is comfortable, and that particular wall has never once judged you back. And now, finally, the bellhop. He's carried your mountain of luggage the entire way, shown you the light switches, demonstrated exactly how the window opens, and pointed toward the bathroom as though revealing hidden treasure, which, in this particular era, it very nearly was. He's done his job admirably. And so he lingers in that same familiar practice pause, waiting for the small coin that acknowledges his effort. You oblige. He beams, wishes you a wonderful stay, and finally, mercifully, leaves you alone. The door clicks shut, and for the first time since your taxi pulled up outside, there is silence and privacy. The room, at last, is entirely yours. You sink into the armchair, or perhaps give the bed one experimental bounce, and feel the full weight of the luxury finally settle around you. Then your eye drifts toward a door tucked in the corner, the one leading to the single most impressive feature of the entire suite, and you rise to go investigate. Let's talk about the true luxury of this entire era, the one that would have genuinely stopped your grandparents in their tracks, a private bathroom all to yourself. No shared facility down the hall, no quiet negotiations with neighbors over bath time. Instead, gleaming white porcelain, polished chrome taps, and hot water arriving on demand as though summoned by some kind of magic. There's a deep tub, thick towels, and small bars of soap wrapped just for you. For a great many travelers of the 1920s, this was, quite simply, the single most impressive thing about the entire hotel, and it's genuinely easy to understand why. To appreciate it fully, you have to remember what most people were coming from. In countless homes and cheaper boarding houses of the period, the bathroom was a shared affair, a single facility serving an entire floor of strangers, or in plenty of cases, an outhouse in the yard. Bathing itself was an event requiring planning, hauling water, and heating it over a fire. So to walk into a hotel room and discover your own private tub, your own basin, and hot water appearing the instant you turned a tap wasn't a minor convenience at all. It was a genuine glimpse of the future, tiled neatly in white porcelain. That hot water really is the quiet miracle here. Somewhere far below you, enormous boilers and networks of pipes worked constantly to deliver warmth to hundreds of rooms simultaneously, so that any guest, on any floor at nearly any hour, could summon a hot bath without hauling a single bucket or lighting so much as a match. You simply turned the tap, watched the steam begin to rise, and lowered yourself into water heated by an entirely invisible system you never had to think about once. The tub itself was often a genuine object of beauty, a deep cast-iron basin coated in gleaming enamel, sometimes standing proudly on small clawed feet. It was built for real soaking, for lying back and letting the heat work its way into bones weary from long train journeys and even longer days of being endlessly fussed over. Beside it sat towels thick enough to lose an entire hand inside, folded with something close to military precision by staff whose sole job was ensuring that even the act of drying off felt indulgent. Then there were the small courtesies, the little wrapped bars of soap, set out freshly for every single guest. It seems a tiny detail, but it carried a quiet message all its own. This has been prepared specifically for you, and no one else has touched it. In a world where so much was shared and reused, that small sealed bar of soap was a genuine private luxury, the distant ancestor of every little travel-size bottle you've ever quietly slipped into a bag on the way out the door. Of course, the plumbing wasn't always flawless. Pipes could knock and groan. Water occasionally ran rust-colored for a moment before clearing. Pressure might sputter if half the building decided to bathe at the exact same hour. The technology was new enough that its occasional hiccups were forgiven with an easy shrug. Guests were simply too delighted to have any of it at all to spend much time complaining about the small details. When the alternative is a bucket and a prayer, a slightly noisy pipe is a very small price to pay. So you fill the tub, watch the steam curl gently toward the ceiling, and sink into water summoned seemingly from thin air, feeling like the most fortunate person in the entire city. And when you finally emerge, pink and thoroughly relaxed, you reach for the wall to flip on a light and find yourself quietly amazed all over again. You reach out, flip a small switch, and the room floods instantly with electric light. No matches, no oil, no smoke, no fuss at all. In the 1920s, this still felt like a genuine small miracle to a great many guests, particularly those who'd grown up squinting by candlelight or hissing gas lamps. Bulbs glowed warmly in the lamps, in the ceiling fixtures, sometimes even tucked inside the closet, as though the hotel simply couldn't resist showing off a little. You can read comfortably in bed, find your shoes at midnight without stumbling, and switch the world on and off entirely at will. To understand the wonder of it properly, picture the alternative many guests still remembered vividly. Gas lamps that hissed and flickered, gave off unwanted heat and fumes, and carried an unsettling habit of catching nearby curtains alight if left too close. Candles that dripped and guttered, plunging a room into sudden darkness the moment a draft found them. Oil lamps that demanded constant trimming, filling, and careful tending. For most of human history, light had been a fiddly, faintly dangerous chore. And now, quite suddenly, it was simply a switch on the wall. Grand hotels leaned into this new magic with an enthusiasm bordering on genuine showmanship. Electric light was scattered generously throughout the entire building, in the grand public rooms, along every hallway, and right into your own private space. Some hotels made a deliberate point of blazing with light after dark, their windows glowing warmly out over the city like a kind of advertisement all on its own. "Look at us," the illuminated facade seemed to say. "We are modern. We are electric. And we are absolutely not going to make you carry a candle to bed." The controls themselves were part of the delight, too. A switch beside the door meant you could light the entire room before ever stepping into it, banishing the dark before it had any chance to unsettle you. A lamp beside the bed meant you could read late into the night and then extinguish the light without ever having to climb back out from under the covers. It sounds almost absurd to marvel at a light switch today, but marvel they genuinely did. Because it replaced an entire era of fumbling blindly in the dark. There were quirks, naturally, since the technology was still relatively young. Wiring wasn't always perfectly reliable. Bulbs occasionally burned out with a small, sudden pop. The light itself could run dimmer and warmer than the crisp glow we take for granted today. Some fixtures buzzed faintly. Some flickered when the building's overall demand surged. But these were simply the small growing pains of a genuine revolution, and nobody who'd spent their childhood squinting at a candle flame was inclined to complain about a bulb that occasionally hummed. There was real theater in electric light, too, and the hotels understood that perfectly well. A chandelier blazing with dozens of bulbs could transform an ordinary ballroom into something resembling a jewel box. Softly lit lamps in a lounge created an atmosphere of hushed elegance. Light became a genuine design tool, a way of shaping mood and space, rather than merely a means of not tripping over the furniture in the dark. The Grand Hotel was, in its own way, one of the very first places where ordinary travelers experienced light being used deliberately, purely for beauty's sake. So you stand there in your softly glowing room, flicking the switch on and off once or twice simply to enjoy the effortless power of it, feeling briefly like someone who has personally mastered the sun. It's a small, slightly silly pleasure, and it is entirely, genuinely real. Then, from the desk, comes a polite little ring, and you turn toward another modern marvel waiting patiently for your attention. On the desk sits a marvel all its own, a telephone. And not just any telephone, but one connected to a small army of operators tucked away somewhere deep inside the building. You lift the receiver, and a polite voice asks how she may connect you. Want to reach the front desk? Another room? Someone clear across the city? She'll handle all of it. Behind the scenes, rows of switchboard operators sit at towering boards, plugging and unplugging cords at a dizzying speed, quietly listening to the pulse of the entire hotel hum through their headsets. The telephone in your room was, by itself, a genuine status symbol. Plenty of private homes still had no telephone at all, so having one sitting right there on the nightstand, ready to connect you to the world at a moment's notice, was a real and noticeable luxury. You didn't dial a number the way you might picture it. You lifted the receiver, waited for the operator, and simply told her what you wanted, and she made it happen. The machine on your desk was really just a doorway to a person whose entire job was connecting you to other people. Those people, the switchboard operators, were the beating heart of the hotel's nervous system. Seated at enormous boards studded with sockets and blinking lights, they handled a relentless stream of calls, routing each one by hand with a quick, practiced motion. It was demanding work requiring a sharp memory, a steady hand, and near unshakable patience, since guests were not always at their most gracious when they wanted a call connected immediately. The role was filled almost entirely by young women, prized for courteous voices and quick fingers, and they became the invisible hostesses of the whole operation, heard by everyone, seen by almost no one. The system also connected the hotel to itself in wonderfully convenient ways. From the comfort of your own room, you could ring the front desk with a question, summon a late supper, request a wake-up call, or leave word for another guest. It was concierge service, alarm clock, and messaging system, all funneled through a single polite conversation. Of course, this convenience came with a certain delicate lack of privacy that guests simply learned to accept, since a human being physically connected every call. Discretion was drilled into operators as an absolute professional necessity, and the good ones treated whatever they overheard as sacred. Should the room grow a touch chilly, there's another quiet marvel clanking away beneath your window. This is central heating, pipes and radiators pumping warmth through the entire building from a great boiler far below. No chopping wood, no tending a fire, no waking to frost creeping across the inside of the glass. You simply exist in comfortable warmth, courtesy of pipes you'll never see and men in the basement you'll never meet. The only real downside is the noise, since these radiators prefer to announce their hard work rather loudly, knocking, hissing, and occasionally producing a dramatic bang that left first-time guests lying awake, convinced something had gone terribly wrong, only to learn it was simply the building keeping them warm and being noisy about it. When evening arrives, you may return to find your bed quietly transformed. Covers folded neatly back, pillows plumped, curtains drawn, perhaps a small something waiting on the nightstand. This is Turndown service, performed by staff who slip in and out while you're at dinner, leaving your room somehow more comfortable than you left it. Behind that quiet magic stood a chambermaid, one of the hardest-working members of the entire staff, whose long day was a march through room after room making beds, replacing towels, dusting, sweeping, setting everything back to flawless order. And should hunger strike before sleep takes you, you needn't even leave your room, because a single ring of the telephone can summon a full meal directly to your door. Before long, a waiter appears pushing a cart draped in white linen, gleaming silver domes concealing your dinner as though it were a small, unveiled work of art. Room service was a genuine flex, letting you enjoy a full meal in your dressing gown, while the rest of the world stayed properly buttoned up. Somewhere in your evening, someone will also offer you a glass of ice water, and they'll be quietly proud of it. Americans of the era were famous, even to bewildered European visitors, for their devotion to ice, and a grand hotel could produce it in staggering quantities. Refrigeration was still a growing luxury, and a hotel that could chill your drink on demand was showing off its modern muscle in the simplest possible way. Then comes the true challenge of the evening, dressing for dinner. Gentlemen navigated the strict grammar of black jackets, stiff collars, and fiddly studs. Ladies assembled shimmering flapper-era gowns with beading and fringe, the whole ensemble built for an entrance. The grand dining room awaited below, white linen, glittering chandeliers, a maitre d' who sized you up in a single glance, and an intimidating row of silverware demanding you work from the outside in, one course at a time. And then, of course, there was the strange twist of the age, Prohibition, and the mysteriously empty room where the bar used to be, though the alcohol, as you'd soon discover, hadn't really vanished at all. Now for the strangest twist of the whole era. You might wander the hotel looking for a lively bar, hopping for a proper drink after dinner, and instead find nothing but a suspiciously empty room where the bar clearly used to stand. Welcome to Prohibition, which since 1920 had made the sale of alcohol illegal across the entire country. Almost overnight, the grand hotel bars that had once been the beating heart of social life were shuttered, dismantled, or awkwardly repurposed into something more respectable looking. Officially, there was not a single drop of liquor to be found anywhere. To understand how strange this was, you have to picture what the hotel bar had once been. For decades it was a genuine social and financial cornerstone, a gathering place where men discussed business, travelers unwound, and the hotel earned a healthy share of its income. Noisy, convivial, central to everything. And then, with the stroke of a law, it was simply forbidden. The financial blow was enormous. Many establishments scrambled to convert their old barrooms into cafes, tea lounges, or extra dining space, anything to recover some of that lost trade. Bottles vanished from the shelves. The counters were torn out or hidden away. It was a strange bit of theater, a room pretending it had never served a drink in its life. For the guest, the effect was disorienting. You'd arrived at the height of luxury, surrounded by every comfort imaginable, only to discover that one of the most basic pleasures of a grand hotel had officially ceased to exist. But do not despair too quickly, because the alcohol did not truly vanish. It simply learned to be discreet. Behind locked doors in private suites, through quiet arrangements with exactly the right member of staff, a determined guest could still find precisely what they were looking for, provided they knew how to ask. Bellhops became informal suppliers. A quiet word, a discreet exchange, and the impossible was arranged. Many guests also arrived prepared, tucking a personal flask into their luggage, and the hotel would happily provide everything else, ice, glasses, mixers, all perfectly legal on their own. The hotel served no alcohol, technically. It merely served everything that happened to go alongside it. The whole arrangement depended on mutual discretion. The hotel maintained its respectable public face, staff kept their knowing silence, and guests conducted their indulgences quietly behind closed doors. It was a kind of polite conspiracy spanning management, staff, and guests alike, everyone pretending in public what none of them practiced in private. As the night deepens, follow the music toward the ballroom, the glittering heart of the hotel after dark. A live orchestra fills the vast space with sound. The dance floor gleams like a frozen lake, and couples in their absolute finest swirl beneath enormous chandeliers. This was the age of jazz, and the hotel ballroom was where the modern world came to show itself off. The ballroom was built for spectacle on a grand scale, high-ceilinged, ringed with mirrors, dripping with light, able to hold hundreds of guests while still feeling airy and open. A polished wooden floor gleamed underfoot, kept that way by staff who understood a dance floor was only as good as its shine. At the center of it all was the music, and the music was changing fast. This was the decade just swept into the mainstream, and hotel orchestras rode that wave enthusiastically, moving from smooth numbers to livelier tunes that kept the floor in constant motion. The dancing itself was the real point. Couples moved through the fashionable steps of the day, some smooth and gliding, others bright and kicking, all of it lit by the glow of the chandeliers overhead. The fashion on display was half the show, shimmering beaded gowns catching the light with every turn, sharp evening jackets, hair sleek and polished, jewelry sparkling. To stand at the edge of that floor and watch it swirl was to witness the decade performing its own legend, live, in real time. You're pulled toward the floor yourself, and here you'll need to keep up, because the era introduced dances that were fast, playful, and just slightly scandalous to the older generation watching stiffly from the sidelines. Energetic kicks, swinging arms, a level of physical exuberance that struck disapproving elders as faintly ridiculous, which, naturally, only made the younger crowd love it more. Beneath all that fun ran something a little deeper, too. The decade had emerged from years of hardship, and there was a real determination in all that dancing to seize pleasure and freedom, while it could still be had. Eventually the music slows, the night grows late, and the pull of that carefully turned down bed becomes impossible to ignore. But before we return there, a couple of daytime comforts are worth a visit first, starting with a proper morning shave. Come morning, a gentleman guest might wander down to the hotel barbershop, a small palace of grooming all its own. Here you settle into a deep leather chair, lean back, and surrender your face to a barber armed with a straight razor, hot towels, and a seemingly endless supply of conversation. First come the hot towels, softening the beard, warm and faintly suffocating in the most pleasant way. Then the lather, worked up carefully with a brush. And finally the blade itself, gliding across your skin with practiced, almost alarming confidence. You sit very still, of course. A straight razor at your throat is a powerful incentive to avoid sudden movements, sneezes, or strong opinions. The barbershop was also a deeply social space, a kind of clubhouse where men gathered, gossiped, and passed the time, conversation flowing easily from business to sport to the news of the day. You emerged rumpled and left gleaming, smelling faintly of something costly, one more small indulgence folded neatly into the price of your stay. Your clothing, meanwhile, was being cared for by people you'd likely never see at all. Leave a suit out overnight, and it would simply disappear, returning cleaned, pressed, and looking somehow better than the day you bought it. Shoes left by the door were shined to a mirror finish while you slept. In an age before easy home laundering, this invisible labor was a genuine luxury, performed by staff whose entire purpose was making you look effortlessly put together, no matter how dusty and travel-worn you'd arrived. Now let's talk about the small folded bills quietly changing hands all over this building, because in a grand hotel, tipping was practically a competitive sport. The doorman, the bellhop, the elevator operator, the waiter, the valet, the maid, the barber, each expected a little something, and each one remembered exactly how generous you had been. Getting this delicate economy right was a genuine art form. Get it wrong, and you'd find yourself with slower service and noticeably cooler smiles for the rest of your stay. For the staff, tips weren't a pleasant bonus but a fundamental part of the arrangement. Many hotel workers earned modest official wages, with the clear understanding that tips would make up a significant share of their real income. A guest known for generosity found doors opening a little faster and requests met a little more eagerly. It was a quiet currency all its own, spendable in comfort and convenience throughout your entire stay. Behind every polished surface you admired stood a hidden world of hard labor keeping it that way. Cooks, dishwashers, chambermaids, porters, engineers tending the boilers, laundry crews churning through mountains of linen, an enormous staff working long, demanding hours in kitchens, boiler rooms, and back corridors you would never once glimpse. The entire design of the building worked to keep this labor invisible, timed to happen while guests were at dinner or out for the evening, so that comfort always appeared effortless, as though the hotel simply ran itself. Not everyone wandering the halls, either, was a paying guest. The house detective moved quietly through the lobby, dressed like any ordinary visitor, watching for thieves, con artists, and anything that might embarrass the establishment. His greatest skill was blending in completely, present everywhere, conspicuous nowhere. And it's worth pausing honestly here, too. For all their glamour, these hotels reflected the harsh divisions of their era. Access was shaped heavily by race and class, and many Americans were barred from staying as guests at all, permitted inside only as the very workers who kept the building running. It's an uncomfortable truth sitting beneath all the sparkle, and it deserves to be remembered honestly alongside everything else. Eventually, every stay must end, and that means one final visit to the front desk, where the clerk produces a neatly itemized bill. The room, the meals, the calls, every small charge quietly tallied. You pay, tip one last round of familiar faces, and the doorman hails your taxi as your luggage reappears, packed and ready, exactly as it had vanished on arrival. The grand hotels of the 1920s represented the very peak of a certain American glamour: marble, jazz, ice water, and endless attentive service. It wouldn't last. The crash at the decade's end, followed by the long grip of the Depression, would slowly empty the ballrooms and quiet the lobbies across the whole country. But for one shining decade, these hotels were dazzling little kingdoms, gathering the newest marvels of the age and wrapping them in beauty, ceremony, and care. And here's the quiet wonder of it all. Nearly every marvel that once left those guests breathless: hot running water, electric light, warmth without a fire. A voice carried instantly across the city waits for you right now, in your own home, treated as nothing special at all. You're surrounded by comforts a 1920s millionaire would have genuinely envied. So tonight, as you sink into your own soft bed, warm and clean and cared for, let the marble halls fade gently away. Rest easy, sleep well, and drift off in a comfort no grand hotel could ever quite match. Let's go back to the very beginning again, but this time, let's slow everything down and really live inside each moment, because there is so much more hiding in the details than most people realize. Before you ever reach the hotel at all, your journey likely began at a train station, and that station was its own small theater of exhaustion and anticipation. Picture the scene: steam rising from the locomotive in great white clouds, porters in red caps calling out for luggage, the screech of iron wheels against iron rails. You've been sitting for hours, perhaps days, in a compartment that felt smaller with every passing mile, your good traveling suit slowly losing its crispness, your collar wilting in the heat of the carriage. By the time you step down onto the platform, you are not exactly at your best, and you know it. A porter appears almost instantly, offering to carry your bags to a waiting taxi, and you hand over your trunk with the particular relief of someone who has been carrying it, quite literally, on their conscience for the entire journey. The taxi itself is an adventure of its own in this era: narrow tires bouncing over cobblestones, the driver weaving confidently through a chaos of horse carts, delivery trucks, and other automobiles all fighting for the same narrow street. You watch the city blur past the window, buildings growing taller and grander the closer you get to the hotel district, until finally, there it is, rising up ahead of you like a mountain made of stone and glass. This anticipation matters because it shapes everything that follows. You do not simply walk into a grand hotel. You arrive at one, weary and travel-stained, carrying with you the accumulated grime and fatigue of the outside world, and the hotel's entire design exists to erase that fatigue as quickly and as elegantly as possible. Every single person you're about to meet, from the doorman onward, has one shared unspoken mission: to make you forget, within minutes, that you were ever tired at all. Let's return to that doorman once more, because there's more to unpack in his role than a single glance reveals. Consider the sheer physical stamina of the job itself. He is on his feet for hours at a stretch, often working shifts that would exhaust a much younger man in a much easier position. In the depths of a January cold snap, with wind cutting straight off the street. He stands there in his coat and gloves, greeting each arrival with the same warmth he showed the person before, and the person before that. In the thick of a July heat wave, sweat gathering beneath his stiff collar, he performs the same unbothered calm, because a doorman who looks uncomfortable makes the entire hotel look uncomfortable by association. There is also a psychological skill to the position that's easy to overlook. He must instantly read each arriving guest and adjust his manner accordingly. A nervous first-time traveler needs gentle reassurance, a few extra words of guidance about where to go and what to expect. A seasoned society regular wants quick, efficient recognition, not fussing conversation, and certainly not being treated like a stranger to the building. A blustering businessman wants his self-importance quietly confirmed, without ever being told so directly. The doorman becomes, in effect, a rapid character study conducted in the span of about 15 seconds, and he must get it right nearly every single time or risk irritating the very first person a guest encounters. And then there is the memory work, which frankly borders on the impressive. Grand hotels of significant size might see dozens, sometimes hundreds, of arrivals and departures each day, and a truly excellent doorman carried an internal ledger of faces, names, and preferences that would put a modern database to shame. He remembered that the gentleman in room 412 preferred his taxi called 10 minutes before he actually appeared at the door. He remembered that the elderly widow who visited every autumn liked her arrival announced quietly, without fuss, because loud greetings made her self-conscious. This kind of granular, personal memory was the actual currency of good service in this era, long before any hotel kept formal records of guest preferences. Now, once you're through those doors and standing in the lobby, let's linger there a good deal longer than we did before, because a grand hotel lobby in the 1920s was really a small city unto itself, with its own daily rhythms, its own cast of recurring characters, and its own unspoken rules governing who belonged where. Consider the time of day. A grand hotel lobby in the late morning had an entirely different character than the same room at 5 in the afternoon, and different again at midnight. In the morning, the lobby was busy with departures, guests settling bills, luggage being wheeled out, the brisk, efficient energy of people beginning their day's business. Businessmen in sharp suits moved through with newspapers tucked under their arms, already thinking about the meetings ahead. A scattering of tourists lingered near the concierge desk, working out maps and directions for a day of sightseeing. By mid-afternoon, the energy shifted entirely. This was the hour of the palm court, when society ladies gathered for tea, when an orchestra might play something soft and unobtrusive, when the whole room slowed into a kind of leisurely performance of relaxation. This was when reputations were quietly built and rebuilt over cups of tea and careful conversation, when who sat with whom, and who was seen speaking to whom, carried real social weight. A woman might spend the better part of an hour dressing carefully for what was, on paper, simply an afternoon tea, because the palm court was every bit as much a stage as the dining room would be that evening. By evening, everything transformed once more. Guests dressed in their finest emerged from the elevators, the air filling with the low hum of anticipation before dinner. And by late night, the lobby quieted into something almost hushed, a few late arrivals checking in, a night clerk keeping watch behind the desk, the house detective completing his rounds, the whole grand machine humming along at a lower, gentler pitch until the sun rose and the cycle began again. There were recurring characters, too, woven into the daily texture of the lobby. Every grand hotel of any significant size had its permanent residents, wealthy widows, retired businessmen, the occasional eccentric who simply preferred hotel living to the bother of maintaining a private household. These long-term guests became, in a sense, part of the furniture, greeted by name every single day, granted small courtesies and familiarities that transient guests never received. The staff knew their habits intimately. They knew which chair the retired colonel preferred each afternoon, which newspaper the widow in the corner suite liked delivered promptly at 8. Which particular blend of tea satisfied the elderly gentleman who took his seat by the window every single day at 4 o'clock without fail. And then there were the salesmen, an enormous and often underappreciated population of grand hotel guests in this era. Traveling salesmen crisscrossed the entire country by rail, representing everything from farm equipment to fine textiles, and grand hotels, particularly in commercial cities, catered heavily to this population. Many hotels maintained sample rooms specifically for these traveling salesmen, spaces where a man could display his wares to local buyers without needing to rent separate commercial space. It was, in its way, one of the earliest forms of a business center, decades before that term existed. Let's spend more time, too, in the world of the front desk, because there was an entire hidden science to how a room clerk actually did his job, far beyond the simple act of handing over a key. The register itself deserves closer attention. This enormous leather-bound book, sitting open on the counter, was more than a mere administrative tool. It functioned as a kind of social barometer for the entire building. Regular guests would glance at it on their way past, scanning for familiar names, curious about who else had arrived that week. Journalists covering the society pages of local newspapers made a habit of visiting grand hotel registers specifically to check for notable arrivals. A visiting senator, a touring actress, an industrialist whose business dealings were making headlines. A clever hotel manager understood that a single celebrated name in the register could generate a surprising amount of free publicity, and some hotels were known to quietly encourage prominent guests to sign with a flourish, understanding exactly what that signature might mean for the hotel's reputation. The room assignment process, too, was a far more intricate art than simply handing over whichever key happened to be available. A skilled room clerk was constantly running a kind of mental chess game, balancing dozens of considerations at once. Which rooms were currently occupied? Which were being cleaned? Which guests had specifically requested quiet, away from the elevator shaft or the kitchen exhaust? Which regular guests always expected their usual room, and how disappointed they'd be if it wasn't available? Which new arrivals seemed likely to complain, and which seemed unlikely to notice or care about minor inconveniences? There was also, quite frankly, a significant financial dimension to this sorting. Rooms with better views, larger dimensions, or quieter positions commanded higher rates, and a clerk's assessment of a guest's apparent wealth and status directly shaped which rooms were offered, and at which price point. A guest who arrived looking prosperous might be shown only the finer rooms first, with cheaper options mentioned almost as an afterthought, if at all. A guest who appeared to be traveling on a tighter budget might never even be told the better rooms existed. This wasn't malicious, exactly. It was simply the quiet, practiced logic of an industry built entirely around reading people accurately and profiting from that reading. Let's also consider what happened when things went wrong at the front desk, because grand hotels were not immune to chaos, whatever polished face they presented to arriving guests. Overbooking happened with some regularity, particularly during major social events, conventions, or holiday seasons, and a room clerk faced with more confirmed reservations than actual available rooms needed to perform an entirely different kind of diplomatic skill. Some guests might be offered a smaller room temporarily, with the promise of an upgrade the following day. Others might be quietly redirected to a sister property nearby, the hotel absorbing the cost of the alternate arrangement rather than risk offending a valued guest. The truly difficult cases, a guest who arrived without any reservation at all during a fully booked period, required the clerk's most careful diplomatic footwork, delivering disappointing news while somehow leaving the guest feeling that every possible effort had been made on their behalf. Now let's return to the bellhop and spend considerably more time inside his world, Because there is an entire hidden economy and hierarchy among these young men that deserves real attention. Most bellhops in this era were quite young, often teenagers or young men in their early 20s, and the position was frequently viewed as an entry point into the broader hospitality trade. A sharp, capable, well-liked bellhop might, over a period of years, work his way upward through the hotel's internal ranks, perhaps to a position overseeing the other bellhops, perhaps eventually into a role at the front desk itself, or even, for the truly ambitious and talented, toward hotel management. The Grand Hotel functioned, in this sense, as its own small career ladder, with the bellhop position serving as the lowest visible rung. There was a distinct pecking order among the bellhops themselves, too, often invisible to guests but keenly felt by the young men living inside it. Senior bellhops, those who had worked at the hotel longest or proven themselves most capable, typically received the choicest assignments. The wealthy, generous regular guests known for lavish tipping, the high floors with the better views, the busiest and most lucrative shifts. Newer or less favored bellhops might find themselves handling the less desirable tasks, the guests known to tip poorly, the quieter hours when fewer opportunities for gratuities presented themselves. The bellhops also developed, out of pure necessity, an entire unofficial intelligence network about the guests they served. They knew who was generous and who was stingy. They knew which guests preferred to be left entirely alone and which enjoyed a bit of friendly conversation. They knew which rooms housed guests who might be persuaded to part with a particularly generous tip in exchange for a particularly discreet favor, and which guests were, quite simply, more trouble than they were worth. This knowledge passed between bellhops constantly, in hurried conversations near the service elevator, in quiet exchanges during slow moments by the luggage room, forming a kind of oral history of the hotel's guest population that no official record ever captured. Physically, the job demanded a genuine toughness that's easy to underestimate from a comfortable distance of 100 years. A busy bellhop might make dozens of trips up and down the building in a single shift, each one carrying substantial weight, often taking stairs rather than waiting for the passenger elevator during especially busy periods, since a service stairway was frequently faster than waiting for a car that might already be occupied. By the end of a demanding shift, a bellhop's legs and back had absorbed a genuine day's worth of hard labor, however cheerful and effortless he'd managed to make it look in front of each individual guest. And then there was the deeper unofficial economy that we touched on earlier, the role bellhops played during Prohibition specifically. This deserves a fuller exploration, because it reveals something genuinely fascinating about how quickly an entire underground service economy could form around a simple law that most ordinary citizens had no real intention of actually obeying. A guest wishing to acquire alcohol during this period faced a delicate problem. He could not simply walk into a shop and buy a bottle openly. He needed a reliable, discreet intermediary who understood the local supply chains, who knew which suppliers could be trusted, and who could make an arrangement happen quietly, without drawing unwanted attention from hotel management or, worse, from actual law enforcement. The bellhop, already skilled in fetching, arranging, and discreetly solving problems for guests, was perfectly positioned to fill exactly this need. A knowing guest might slip a bellhop a folded bill along with a quiet, carefully worded request, and within the hour, a bottle would appear, delivered with the same practiced discretion the bellhop brought to every other task. The markup on these transactions could be considerable, and a bellhop with reliable underground connections could earn substantially more from this particular service than from carrying luggage all day. It was, in every meaningful sense, a shadow profession operating quietly inside a legitimate one, and hotel management often knew perfectly well it was happening, choosing to look the other way as long as everything remained sufficiently discreet and no scandal ever touched the hotel's public reputation. Let's now go much deeper into the hidden machinery running beneath the entire building, because we barely scratched the surface of it before, and this hidden world genuinely deserves far more attention than it usually receives. Picture for a moment descending below the grand lobby, below even the service corridors most guests never glimpsed, down into the true engine room of the hotel. Here, the atmosphere changes entirely. Gone is the marble and crystal. In its place, exposed pipes, the low roar of machinery, the heat radiating from massive boilers working around the clock. This was the domain of the engineers and stokers, men whose entire working lives were spent in a world of heat, noise, and constant vigilant maintenance, ensuring that upstairs, hundreds of guests could enjoy their hot baths and warm rooms without ever spending a single thought on how any of it actually happened. The boiler room operated on a continuous cycle, day and night, because a grand hotel's demand for hot water and heat never actually stopped. Someone needed to be present at all hours, monitoring pressure gauges, feeding fuel into the furnaces, watching for any sign of mechanical trouble that could, if left unaddressed, escalate into genuine danger. This was hot, physically demanding, frequently dangerous work, performed largely by men whose names appeared on no guest-facing roster, whose faces the vast majority of hotel guests would never once see, and whose labor was, in the truest sense, entirely invisible by design. Above the boiler room, but still well below the guest floors, sprawled the hotel's kitchens, a world unto themselves, easily one of the most intense and demanding environments in the entire building. Picture the scale of the operation required to feed hundreds of guests across multiple dining venues, plus room service, plus banquets and private functions, all simultaneously, all expected to arrive at the guest's table hot, beautifully presented, and precisely correct. At the head of this operation stood the executive chef, a figure of genuine authority within the hotel's internal hierarchy, commanding a kitchen brigade organized with almost military precision. Beneath him worked a whole cascade of specialized roles, sauce chefs, pastry chefs, the staff responsible for soups, for roasts, for the elaborate cold preparations that grand hotel dining so often demanded. Each station operated with its own rhythm and pressure, all of it needing to synchronize perfectly so that a table's entire multi-course meal arrived in the correct sequence, each dish at precisely the right temperature. The heat in these kitchens was often extraordinary, especially in the height of summer, with multiple ranges and ovens running continuously in a space with limited ventilation by modern standards. Kitchen staff worked long, physically brutal shifts, often standing for hours at a stretch amid the clatter of pots, the shouted orders passing between stations, the constant underlying pressure of knowing that a mistake, a delay, an improperly prepared dish, could mean a dissatisfied guest complaining to the front desk, which could, in turn, mean real consequences for the kitchen staff responsible. Dishwashing, too, deserves a moment of real acknowledgement, because it was among the least glamorous and most physically exhausting jobs in the entire building. In an era before automated dishwashing existed in any meaningful commercial capacity, the sheer volume of plates, glasses, silverware, and cooking equipment generated by a busy grand hotel kitchen required teams of workers scrubbing continuously, often standing in hot, humid conditions for the length of an entire shift, handling an endless, unrelenting flow of dirty dishes that never seemed to actually diminish no matter how quickly they worked. Then there was the laundry, another entire department operating largely out of sight, tasked with the staggering job of cleaning the linens, towels, tablecloths, and staff uniforms consumed by a large hotel's daily operations. Picture mountains of white sheets and towels moving through this department daily, each item requiring washing, careful drying, and precise pressing before returning to service. This work, too, was physically demanding, performed in hot, steam-filled rooms, by workers whose labor kept every crisp white sheet and gleaming linen tablecloth looking exactly as flawless as guests expected, without those same guests ever once considering the effort required to achieve that flawlessness. Let's slow down again and spend real time inside the dining experience itself, because there's a great deal more texture worth exploring in the actual rituals of formal dining in this era. Consider the sheer duration of a proper formal dinner in a grand hotel dining room. This was not a quick meal, consumed efficiently and left behind. A full formal dinner might easily stretch across 2 or even 3 hours, moving through course after course at an unhurried, deliberate pace. The meal typically opened with a light soup or consommé, designed to gently awaken the appetite rather than fill the stomach. This would be followed by a fish course, often prepared with delicate French sauces, requiring its own specific fork and knife, distinct from those used for the meat course that would follow. Between courses, there might be a small palate cleanser, perhaps a light sorbet served in a small glass, intended to reset the diner's palate before the richer dishes arrived. Then would come the main course, typically a substantial preparation of meat or poultry, accompanied by carefully composed vegetables and starches, presented with considerable visual artistry. After this, a salad course might appear, followed eventually by cheese and finally dessert, perhaps an elaborate pastry creation, or a simple but beautifully presented fruit course, depending on the occasion and the season. Throughout this entire lengthy procession, waiters moved with a choreographed precision that took years to master properly. A well-trained waiter understood the exact moment to clear a plate, judging subtly from a diner's posture and utensil placement whether the course had truly concluded. He understood how to pour wine without ever appearing to hover, how to refill a water glass without interrupting conversation, how to present the next course with a small flourish that enhanced the theater of the meal without ever drawing undue attention to himself. The very best waiters became almost invisible in their efficiency, present exactly when needed and utterly unnoticeable the remainder of the time. The maitre overseeing this entire dining room operated with an authority that guests rarely fully appreciated. Beyond simply seating arriving diners, he was constantly monitoring the entire room, watching the pace of service at each table, ensuring the kitchen and the waitstaff remained synchronized, managing the delicate diplomacy required when a demanding guest complained, or when two parties both wished for the same particularly desirable table by the window. He functioned in many ways as the conductor of an elaborate live performance repeated nightly, one requiring him to remain endlessly composed regardless of whatever chaos might be unfolding just behind the kitchen doors. Let's also spend a bit more time considering the etiquette itself, because the rules governing formal dining in this period ran far deeper than simply knowing which fork to use. Consider the proper handling of the napkin, unfolded smoothly and placed across the lap immediately upon sitting, never tucked into a collar as though preparing for a particularly messy meal. Consider the precise posture expected at table, upright but not stiff, elbows kept close to the body rather than sprawled across the tablecloth. Consider the careful, quiet manner in which one was expected to signal a waiter, never raising a hand dramatically or calling out, but rather catching his eye with a subtle, practiced glance. There was also an entire unspoken etiquette surrounding conversation at table. Certain topics were considered appropriate for mixed dinner company, while others were firmly reserved for after-dinner conversation among men alone, once the ladies had withdrawn to another room, following a custom inherited from earlier, more formal decades. Business discussions, while common enough among men at lunch, were generally considered somewhat gauche at a formal evening dinner, where lighter, more social conversation was expected to dominate. For a guest unfamiliar with all of this intricate social choreography, a single formal dinner could feel like navigating an obstacle course while attempting to appear completely relaxed and at ease throughout. The genuine skill of gracious dining in this era lay precisely in making all of this elaborate performance look effortless, as though one had simply always known exactly which fork belonged to which course, exactly how to signal a waiter, exactly when conversation should turn light, and when it might, cautiously, turn more serious. Let's also spend considerably more time exploring what an actual evening at the ballroom truly looked and felt like, because there's a wealth of sensory detail worth lingering over here. Picture the orchestra itself, arranged carefully on a raised platform at one end of the vast room, the musicians in matching formal attire, their instruments catching the light from the chandeliers above. A skilled hotel orchestra needed a genuinely broad repertoire, capable of shifting smoothly from a slow, romantic number perfect for a couple dancing close, to something considerably livelier and more energetic that could fill the floor with movement and noise. The bandleader himself often became something of a minor local celebrity, his name printed on hotel advertisements, his particular sound becoming, in the finest hotels, a genuine draw in its own right, something regular guests specifically sought out. The dance floor itself deserves real attention, too. Constructed from sprung wood specifically designed to have a slight give underfoot, easing the strain on dancing feet across a long evening, it was maintained with the same obsessive care as every other surface in the building. Staff polished it regularly, understanding that a scuffed, dull floor would undermine the entire glittering effect the ballroom worked so hard to create. Consider, too, the sheer physical stamina required of the dancers themselves. An evening of dancing in this era, especially amid the more energetic new dances sweeping through the culture, demanded real endurance. Women danced in heeled shoes for hours at a stretch, their beaded and fringed gowns swinging with every movement, the physical exertion considerable despite how effortlessly graceful it might appear from the sidelines. Men, too, found the newer, more athletic dances genuinely demanding, a far cry from the stately, restrained ballroom dances of earlier generations. Between dances, small clusters of conversation would form around the edges of the floor, guests catching their breath, fanning themselves discreetly, exchanging observations about who was dancing with whom, who had arrived in a particularly striking gown, whose dancing skill seemed considerably improved since the previous season. The ballroom, much like the lobby and dining room before it, functioned as its own elaborate stage for social observation and quiet commentary, the dancing itself almost secondary to the broader performance of being seen, dressed beautifully, moving gracefully, belonging visibly to this glittering world. Every grand hotel, in truth, played host to an entire cast of recurring guest archetypes, each bringing their own particular needs, quirks, and demands, and the staff learned to recognize and adapt to each type almost instantly, the moment a guest crossed the threshold. Consider first the honeymooners. Easily recognizable to any experienced hotel staff member, they arrived with a particular glow, a certain nervous newness to how they carried themselves, often traveling with luggage that still bore the crisp, unworn look of items purchased specifically for this trip. Grand hotels cultivated an entire specialized approach to honeymoon guests, understanding that this particular category of visitor represented both a significant opportunity and a delicate responsibility. A skilled hotel staff offered these young couples an extra measure of privacy and discretion. Meals might be quietly arranged in their room more often than for other guests, understanding that a newly married couple might prefer not to navigate the crowded formality of the main dining room every single evening. Flowers might appear in their suite as a small welcoming gesture, a bottle of something celebratory arranged discreetly despite Prohibition's official restrictions, the staff understanding perfectly well what occasion was actually being marked. Then there were the businessmen, an entirely different category with entirely different expectations. These guests, often traveling frequently and staying at the same hotels repeatedly throughout the year, valued efficiency and reliability above almost everything else. They wanted their messages delivered promptly, their morning newspaper waiting outside their door at a precise hour, their laundry returned on schedule without fail. Many of these repeat business travelers developed genuine relationships with hotel staff over years of regular visits, greeted by name, their preferences remembered in exhaustive detail. A particular room clerk might recall, without needing to consult any written record, that a certain traveling businessman preferred a room on the quieter side of the building, disliked being disturbed before 8 in the morning, and always ordered the same simple breakfast delivered to his room rather than eating in the dining hall. The genuinely wealthy society regulars formed their own distinct category entirely, and these guests required perhaps the most delicate handling of all. Accustomed to considerable luxury in their own private homes, they arrived at a hotel with expectations already set extraordinarily high, and the smallest failure of service could provoke genuine displeasure. Staff assigned to serve these guests needed to anticipate needs before they were even voiced, understanding intuitively that a truly wealthy guest should never need to actually ask for anything at all. The finest hotels competed fiercely for this particular category of clientele, understanding that a single satisfied society family, given to extensive travel and extensive spending, could represent enormously valuable and continuous business across many years. And then, more rarely but memorably, there were the genuine celebrities, touring actors, prominent musicians, occasionally a politician of national significance passing through on some larger tour. These guests presented an entirely unique set of challenges. Discretion became paramount, since an overeager staff member mentioning a celebrity's presence to the wrong person could result in crowds gathering outside the hotel, reporters appearing uninvited in the lobby, a level of public attention that most touring celebrities actively wished to avoid during their private hours. The finest hotels developed careful protocols for these situations, sometimes registering a celebrity under an assumed name, arranging for their arrival through a private side entrance rather than the main lobby, coordinating quietly with staff throughout the building to ensure the guest's presence remained as unremarked upon as circumstances allowed. Let's return now to the house detective and spend considerably more time inside his particular world, because his job involved far more nuance and complexity than a simple description can properly capture. A house detective's typical day involved constant, quiet observation woven seamlessly into an appearance of complete idleness. He might spend an entire morning simply seated in a comfortable lobby armchair, a newspaper held loosely in his hands, appearing to any casual observer as nothing more than another guest passing the time. But behind that newspaper, his attention moved constantly across the room, tracking patterns of behavior that would mean nothing to an untrained eye, but carried real significance to someone who had spent years learning to notice them. He watched, for instance, for individuals who lingered too long near the elevator banks without any apparent purpose, potentially waiting for an opportunity to slip upstairs unnoticed. He watched for guests who seemed unfamiliar with their own supposed room number when questioned casually by staff, a possible sign of an imposter attempting to gain unauthorized access to a room that wasn't actually theirs. He watched for the particular nervous energy of someone attempting to sell counterfeit goods or run some small confidence scheme against wealthy, distracted guests moving through the lobby. When actual trouble did arise, the house detective's handling of it revealed the true sophistication of his role. Rather than any dramatic public confrontation, the preferred method was always quiet, private resolution. A suspected thief might be approached with a simple, low-voiced request to step into a private office for a brief conversation. The entire exchange handled with enough calm authority that other guests in the vicinity noticed nothing unusual at all. If theft or fraud was confirmed, local police might eventually become involved, but even this was typically managed with considerable discretion. Guests escorted quietly through a service entrance rather than paraded dramatically through the main lobby in handcuffs. The house detective also served, somewhat unofficially, as a kind of moral guardian for the hotel's reputation, alert to behavior that might embarrass the establishment even when no actual crime was being committed. Unmarried couples registering under circumstances that suggested impropriety might receive a quiet, private word. Excessive noise or disruptive behavior from a guest's room, perhaps stemming from the very Prohibition-era drinking we discussed earlier, might prompt a discreet visit, and a gentle but firm suggestion that things be kept quieter for the remainder of the evening. His judgment in these matters carried real weight within the hotel's internal hierarchy, and a skilled house detective needed genuine wisdom about which situations truly warranted intervention and which were better left entirely alone. Now let's spend real, honest time exploring the deeper realities of race and class within these grand establishments, because this deserves far more than a passing mention, and understanding it fully changes how we should think about this entire glittering world. Throughout much of the country during this period, and not merely in the South, as is sometimes assumed, grand hotels operated under rigid racial exclusion. Black Americans were, in the vast majority of these establishments, simply not permitted to register as guests, regardless of their wealth, their professional accomplishment, or their social standing. A prominent black doctor, lawyer, or businessman, traveling with ample funds and impeccable credentials, would still find the doors of most grand hotels firmly closed to him as a paying guest. This exclusion operated through a combination of explicit local laws in many regions and simple, unspoken but universally understood policy in others. This created enormous practical hardship for black travelers throughout the country, who needed to plan every journey with extraordinary care, researching in advance which limited establishments, often smaller and considerably less luxurious than the grand hotels catering to white clientele, might actually accept them as guests. Entire guidebooks eventually emerged specifically to help black travelers navigate this reality, listing which hotels, boarding houses, and private homes throughout various regions would provide safe, welcoming lodging. This burden, invisible to white travelers who simply walked into whatever grand hotel happened to be nearest, added genuine stress, complexity, and real danger to what should have been a simple matter of finding a place to rest during a journey. And yet, as we noted before, these same excluded populations were absolutely essential to the actual functioning of these hotels. Black workers filled an enormous proportion of the roles that kept the entire operation running. Porters, cooks, maids, waiters, laundry workers, and countless other essential positions were frequently staffed predominantly by black employees, who could enter these buildings freely to perform labor, but were barred from ever sleeping in the very rooms they cleaned, or dining in the very rooms they served. This contradiction sat at the absolute heart of the grand hotel experience during this era, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than glossed over in service of pure nostalgia. Beyond racial exclusion, class distinctions shaped the guest experience in quieter but still significant ways. Recent immigrants, regardless of their financial means, sometimes encountered a cooler reception at the front desk, subtle signals communicated through room assignment, through the tone of the clerk's greeting, through small unstated judgments about accent, dress, or manner. Working-class travelers who had saved considerably to afford even a single night at a grand hotel might find themselves quietly steered toward the least desirable rooms, offered the smallest gestures of hospitality, treated with a correctness that fell noticeably short of the warmth extended to guests who appeared more naturally at home in such surroundings. Understanding these realities doesn't erase the genuine craftsmanship, beauty, and remarkable hospitality these hotels also represented. But holding both truths together, the genuine luxury and the genuine injustice, gives us a fuller, more honest picture of what these gilded palaces actually were, and for whom they were actually built. Let's return now to something lighter, and spend more time exploring the hotel's role as a genuine communication hub, because there's considerably more texture worth uncovering in the mail room and telegraph desk. Picture the hotel's mail room itself, typically tucked just behind or beside the main front desk, staffed by clerks whose entire job revolved around the careful sorting, holding, and delivery of correspondence. Each morning, sacks of mail arrived from the local post office, and these needed to be sorted rapidly by room number, with particular care taken for guests known to receive substantial business correspondence, who might expect their mail delivered directly and promptly rather than left to accumulate at the desk. For long-term guests, particularly the wealthy permanent residents we discussed earlier, mail handling became an especially important and carefully personalized service. A retired businessman living semi-permanently at a grand hotel might receive daily correspondence from investment managers, family members, and old business associates scattered across the country, and the hotel's mail clerk needed to manage this steady flow with genuine reliability, understanding that a lost or delayed letter could carry real consequences for a guest's personal or financial affairs. The telegraph desk operated with an entirely different urgency and character. Telegrams, by their very nature, signaled importance and immediacy, since nobody paid the considerable per-word cost of a telegram for casual conversation. When a telegram arrived for a guest, hotel staff typically prioritized its delivery considerably above ordinary mail, sometimes dispatching a bellhop immediately to locate the guest wherever they happened to be within the building, understanding that telegrams frequently carried urgent business news, family emergencies, or time-sensitive information that couldn't wait for a guest's leisurely return to their room. The particular economy of telegram writing deserves its own moment of appreciation, too. Since cost was calculated by the word, guests and telegraph operators alike developed an entire compressed vocabulary and shorthand style specifically suited to this medium. Unnecessary words like articles and prepositions were routinely dropped. Common phrases were abbreviated according to widely understood conventions. A telegram announcing safe arrival might read simply as a handful of words, communicating everything essential while costing only a fraction of what a fully worded sentence would demand. This discipline of extreme brevity, born entirely of economic necessity, produced its own peculiar literary style, one that later observers would find almost poetic in its stark, compressed clarity. For traveling businessmen, this entire communication infrastructure transformed the Grand Hotel into something considerably more than mere lodging. It became, in effect, a fully functional temporary office, complete with mail service, urgent telegram capability, telephone access, and message-taking staff, allowing a man to conduct substantial business affairs from hundreds or even thousands of miles away from his actual home office, all without missing a single important communication. Now let's move toward the final act of our evening together and spend real time inside the actual moment of departure. Because checking out of a grand hotel carried its own distinct rituals worth exploring fully. The morning of departure typically began with a certain melancholy undertone, even for guests eager to return home. Bags needed packing, a task considerably more involved than it might sound today, given the sheer volume of clothing and accessories a proper traveler carried during an extended stay. A chambermaid might assist with this final packing, carefully folding garments that had been laundered and pressed during the stay, ensuring everything fit back into the trunk with the same careful organization it had originally possessed. The settling of accounts at the front desk deserved its own careful attention, too. A truly detailed itemized bill might run to a full page or more, listing not merely the room charge itself but every incidental expense accumulated throughout the stay. Meals charged to the room, telephone calls placed through the switchboard, each one noted and tallied, laundry and pressing services, barbershop visits, room service deliveries. Even small purchases from hotel shops, if the establishment maintained any, might appear on this final accounting. For guests who had genuinely indulged throughout their stay, this final bill could arrive as something of a shock. the accumulated small pleasures of several days suddenly rendered in stark, undeniable numerical form. A skilled room clerk handled this moment with considerable tact, presenting the bill calmly, prepared to explain any individual charge without seeming defensive, understanding that this final financial reckoning represented, in many ways, the last impression a guest would carry away from their entire stay. The final round of tips followed this settlement, and by this point in the stay, the entire practice had become almost automatic, a kind of closing ceremony performed instinctively. The chambermaid who had kept the room in order throughout the visit typically received her gratuity discreetly, sometimes left directly in the room rather than handed over in person. The bellhop retrieving luggage for the final departure, the doorman hailing the departure taxi, each received their expected due in this closing sequence of small transactions. And then, finally, the actual moment of leaving, luggage loaded into a waiting taxi. A final glance back at the grand facade, the glass canopy, the uniformed doorman already turning his attention toward the next arriving guest. The engine starting, the hotel beginning to shrink in the rear window as the taxi pulled away into ordinary city traffic, carrying you back toward whatever ordinary life awaited beyond those gilded doors. Let's slow down once more and spend genuine time on the sensory texture of this world, because there's an enormous amount left unexplored in simply how a grand hotel actually felt, sounded, and smelled at every hour of the day and night. Begin with scent, because scent, more than almost any other sense, has a way of anchoring memory. A grand hotel lobby carried a particular blended fragrance entirely its own, built from layers accumulated throughout the day. Fresh flowers, replaced regularly in tall vases positioned throughout the public rooms, contributed a sweet, slightly heavy floral note that shifted depending on the season. In winter, hothouse blooms grown specifically to provide color and fragrance during the coldest months carried their own distinct, slightly artificial sweetness. In spring and summer, fresher garden flowers offered a lighter, more natural perfume. Beneath the flowers sat the smell of floor polish and furniture wax, applied nightly by cleaning staff working through the early morning hours while guests slept. This particular scent, sharp and faintly chemical, mingled with the flowers to create something distinctly recognizable as belonging specifically to grand hotel spaces, a smell most guests would have instantly associated with luxury itself, even without consciously identifying its individual components. Cigar and cigarette smoke drifted through the lobby and lounges throughout the day, since smoking was an entirely unremarkable and constant presence in this era, particularly among the men clustered near the columns discussing business. This tobacco scent mingled with the flowers and polish, creating a layered aroma that would have struck a modern visitor as almost overwhelming, but which contemporary guests experienced as simply the ordinary atmosphere of an elegant public space. The dining room carried its own distinct olfactory character, shifting throughout the evening as different courses moved through the kitchen and out to waiting tables. The rich, buttery aroma of French sauces, the particular sharp scent of fresh bread, baked daily in the hotel's own kitchens and delivered warm to each table. The faint sweetness of dessert courses arriving toward the meal's conclusion. And beneath all of this, the constant presence of candle wax from the table settings, and the perfume worn by the women dining throughout the room, each guest's individual scent contributing to an overall atmosphere that felt distinctly occasion-worthy. Now consider sound, because a grand hotel soundscape was every bit as carefully composed as its visual presentation, even if less obviously designed. The lobby's particular acoustic quality, with its high ceilings and hard marble surfaces, created a distinctive echo and resonance. Footsteps clicked crisply across the floor. Conversations, pitched deliberately low out of social convention, blended into a general murmur rather than any individual distinguishable words. The occasional laugh, quickly moderated back down to an appropriate volume, the soft creak of a revolving door, the distant, barely perceptible hum of the building's mechanical systems working somewhere far below. At night, this soundscape transformed considerably. The daytime bustle faded into something closer to true quiet, punctuated occasionally by the distant clatter of a service cart being wheeled through a back corridor, the soft ding of an elevator arriving on some distant floor, the occasional muffled conversation drifting from a room as a guest said good night to a late-night visitor. In your own room, that steady, familiar clank and hiss of the radiator provided a kind of constant background rhythm, something most guests eventually stopped consciously noticing after the first night or two, the sound becoming simply part of the texture of sleep itself. The ballroom, of course, offered an entirely different sonic experience altogether. The layered sound of a full orchestra, brass and strings blending together, the rhythmic thump of dancing feet against the sprung wooden floor, the overlapping conversations and laughter of hundreds of guests all enjoying themselves simultaneously. This was sound as spectacle, deliberately amplified and celebrated, standing in deliberate contrast to the hushed, disciplined quiet expected everywhere else in the building. Now let's widen our view considerably and spend real time comparing how grand hotels actually differed from city to city, because the character of these establishments varied enormously depending on their particular location and clientele. Consider first the great hotels of New York City, which existed in a category almost entirely their own. New York's grand hotels catered to an extraordinarily concentrated population of genuine wealth, international visitors, and the entertainment and business elite of the entire nation. These hotels tended toward the most extravagant scale and the most cosmopolitan atmosphere, with staff accustomed to serving international guests, multiple languages sometimes spoken fluently among the front desk personnel, and a general sense of being at the absolute center of fashionable, moneyed American life. The competition among New York's finest hotels was fierce, each establishment constantly working to outdo its rivals in terms of decoration, service, and the particular prestige of its guest list. Chicago's grand hotels carried a somewhat different character, shaped by the city's particular identity as a booming industrial and commercial center. Chicago hotels catered heavily to businessmen, particularly those connected to the meat-packing, manufacturing, and railroad industries that had built the city's fortune. There was, in Chicago's grand hotels, perhaps a slightly less rarefied, slightly more robustly commercial atmosphere compared to their New York counterparts, though the finest establishments still offered every comfort and luxury one might expect from the era's most celebrated hospitality. Then there were the great resort hotels scattered along the coastlines and in mountain retreats, which operated according to an entirely different rhythm altogether. These establishments, often open only during particular seasons, catered to guests seeking extended leisure rather than brief business stopovers. A coastal resort hotel might see guests staying for weeks or even entire months at a time, particularly wealthy families escaping summer heat in the cities, settling into an extended routine of beach mornings, afternoon tea, and evening entertainment that unfolded across an entire season rather than a single brief visit. These resort establishments developed their own particular specialized staff and amenities suited to this extended leisure model. Beach attendants managing rented umbrellas and chairs along the shoreline. Extensive recreational facilities, including tennis courts, golf courses, and swimming facilities, staffed by their own dedicated instructors and attendants. A resort hotel's entertainment calendar often stretched across an entire season, with regular dances, theatrical performances, and social events designed to keep guests engaged and entertained across weeks rather than mere days. The social dynamics at these resort hotels, too, differed considerably from their urban counterparts. With guests remaining for extended periods, genuine friendships and social hierarchies developed across an entire season regular gatherings creating a kind of temporary community among the guests, quite distinct from the more transient, anonymous quality of a typical urban grand hotel, where most guests came and went within a matter of days. Southern grand hotels, meanwhile, operated within their own particular regional context, often reflecting the more rigid and explicitly codified racial segregation that characterized the region during this period, alongside a particular tradition of Southern hospitality that shaped everything from the style of cuisine, served to the more leisurely, unhurried pace often associated with Southern social life. Let's now spend considerable additional time exploring the deeper mechanics of the hotel's staff hierarchy, because there's a rich and complex organizational structure worth understanding fully. At the very top of this hierarchy stood the general manager, a figure of considerable authority and responsibility, ultimately answerable for every aspect of the hotel's operation and reputation. A successful hotel general manager needed to combine genuine business acumen with an almost diplomatic sensitivity to the needs and expectations of wealthy, demanding guests, while simultaneously managing the practical realities of running an enormously complex operation involving hundreds of staff members across dozens of specialized departments. Beneath the general manager typically sat a layer of department heads, each responsible for a particular sphere of the hotel's operation. The executive housekeeper oversaw the entire cleaning and room preparation staff, responsible for the training, scheduling, and quality control of dozens or even hundreds of chambermaids and cleaning personnel. This was, in many hotels, one of the few senior management positions regularly held by women, reflecting a broader pattern where housekeeping and domestic management were considered appropriately feminine domains of authority, even within an otherwise male-dominated management structure. The chief engineer oversaw all the mechanical systems we discussed earlier, the boilers, the electrical systems, the elevators, and the plumbing, commanding his own team of specialized technical staff. The executive chef commanded the kitchen brigade with an authority that, within his own domain, sometimes rivaled or even exceeded that of the general manager himself, since a truly talented chef represented enormous value to a hotel's reputation and could often negotiate considerable autonomy as a condition of his continued employment. Below these department heads extended the actual working staff, organized into their own internal hierarchies within each department. Among the housekeeping staff, senior chambermaids with years of experience typically oversaw newer employees, training them in the exacting standards expected and monitoring the quality of their work. Among the waitstaff, a headwaiter typically oversaw the dining room service, assigning specific waiters to specific tables and sections, with the most experienced and capable waiters typically receiving the most lucrative assignments, serving the sections most likely to produce generous tips. Advancement through this hierarchy was possible but rarely rapid, typically requiring years of demonstrated reliability and skill before a worker might be promoted to a more senior or more lucrative position. For many staff members, particularly those in the least visible, lowest-paid positions, such as kitchen dishwashers or laundry workers, the realistic path for advancement was limited, and many spent their entire working lives within the same basic role, their labor forming an essential but largely unacknowledged foundation for the entire glittering enterprise operating above them. Let's spend real time now imagining a single, complete day in the life of this hotel, following different staff members through their hours, because seeing the whole operation woven together this way reveals just how enormous and intricate the entire machine truly was. Picture the hotel at 4 in the morning, hours before most guests would even consider stirring. In the boiler room, the night engineer maintains his lonely vigil, monitoring pressure gauges by the dim glow of a single overhead bulb, feeding coal into the furnace at regular intervals, The only sounds around him the steady mechanical rhythm of pumps and the occasional distant clank traveling up through the pipes toward the sleeping rooms above. He has perhaps 6 more hours before his replacement arrives, and the hotel depends entirely on his continued attention, though not a single guest sleeping comfortably upstairs will ever know his name or spare him a single conscious thought. By 5, the kitchen begins to stir. Bakers arrive first, well before the rest of the kitchen staff, needing hours to prepare the fresh bread and pastries that guests will expect with their breakfast. The ovens are lit, flour dust hangs faintly in the air, and the rhythmic sound of dough being worked fills the otherwise quiet kitchen. By 6, additional kitchen staff begin arriving, the pace gradually building as breakfast preparations intensify. At 6:30, the night doorman, who has stood at his post through the quiet, empty hours of early morning, greets the first arriving day shift bellhops, exchanging a few tired words before finally heading home to sleep through the daylight hours most people spend awake. His replacement takes up the post, straightening his coat, preparing for the day's first arrivals. By 7, chambermaids begin their rounds, though guests are still largely asleep behind closed doors. This early hour is reserved for the less visible tasks, restocking supply closets, preparing linen carts, coordinating with the housekeeping supervisor about which rooms will need particular attention that day, perhaps due to a checkout requiring a complete refresh before a new guest's afternoon arrival. By 8, the lobby begins its true daily awakening. Early risers descend for breakfast. The day's first mail delivery arrives, requiring immediate sorting. The front desk clerk beginning his shift reviews the overnight arrival and departure records, preparing himself for the day's particular challenges, perhaps noting that a difficult regular guest is due to check out today, or that a significant social event that evening will require careful coordination between the front desk, the dining room, and the ballroom staff. By mid-morning, the hotel reaches a kind of steady operational rhythm. Guests move through the lobby toward various daily activities. The Palm Court begins preparing for its afternoon tea service, staff arranging fresh flowers and checking that the small orchestra's instruments and sheet music are properly organized for their afternoon performance. In the laundry, workers process the previous day's accumulated linens and guest clothing, the steam-filled rooms already hot despite the relatively early hour. By early afternoon, the kitchen shifts its focus toward lunch service, while simultaneously beginning preparation for the considerably more elaborate demands of that evening's dinner service. This overlapping preparation requires careful coordination, the kitchen brigade moving between multiple simultaneous tasks with a precision built from years of practiced routine. By late afternoon, the Palm Court fills with its regular tea-time crowd, the orchestra playing softly, while upstairs, chambermaids complete their turndown preparations for guests expected to be out at dinner that evening. The front desk handles a steady stream of check-ins, as new arrivals begin appearing ahead of the evening's social activities. By early evening, the entire hotel shifts into its most intensive period. Guests dress for dinner. Bellhops and elevator operators handle a steady flow of traffic between floors. The dining room fills with reservations, and the kitchen operates at its absolute peak intensity, dozens of dishes moving simultaneously through preparation toward dozens of different tables, each requiring precise timing and presentation. By late evening, as dinner service winds down and guests move toward the ballroom for dancing, a different set of staff takes over primary responsibility. The orchestra performs, waiters circulate through the ballroom offering refreshments, while in guest rooms throughout the building, the invisible work of turndown service and overnight preparation continues quietly. By midnight, the hotel gradually quiets. The ballroom's crowd thins. The dining room has long since closed. A skeleton crew of night staff takes over primary responsibility. A night clerk at the front desk, a reduced overnight kitchen staff prepared for any late room service requests, the elevator operator working his final rounds before a night operator takes his place, and somewhere below, that same lonely boiler room vigil beginning again, the whole enormous machine settling into its quietest, most invisible rhythm, waiting for the cycle to begin once more with the coming dawn. Now let's turn our attention toward the eventual ending of this entire golden era, and spend genuine time exploring exactly how and why this glittering world eventually came apart. The prosperity that built these grand hotels rested on a particular set of economic conditions specific to the 1920s: rising wages for a significant portion of the population, expanding access to credit, a booming stock market that created genuine and often illusory wealth simultaneously, and a broader cultural mood of confidence and optimism about the future. Grand hotels, requiring enormous capital investment, and depending on a steady stream of guests both willing and able to pay premium prices, flourished precisely because this particular economic and cultural moment made such extravagance seem not merely possible but almost inevitable. When the stock market crashed at the close of the decade, the effects rippled outward with a speed that caught even experienced hotel operators genuinely off guard. Guests who had once traveled frequently and spent freely suddenly found their circumstances dramatically altered. Businessmen who had maintained standing reservations at their favorite grand hotels canceled extended travel plans. Their companies suddenly focused on survival rather than expansion. Wealthy families who had spent entire summers at resort hotels found their fortunes, built substantially on paper stock values, evaporating with shocking speed. The immediate effect on hotel occupancy was severe. Rooms that had once commanded waiting lists during peak seasons now sat empty for extended stretches. Hotels that had operated at or near full capacity throughout the prosperous years of the decade suddenly found themselves struggling to fill even a fraction of their rooms. The fixed costs of maintaining such an enormous physical plant, the boilers, the elevators, the vast permanent staff, remaining largely unchanged even as revenue collapsed. Hotel management across the country faced difficult, often painful decisions. Staff reductions became unavoidable, and the very workers who had provided the invisible labor sustaining the entire luxurious experience were often the first to lose their positions entirely. A hotel that had once employed hundreds might find itself forced to operate with a fraction of that staff, remaining employees taking on multiple roles simply to keep basic operations functioning. Some hotels attempted to adapt by lowering their rates significantly, hoping to attract a broader base of guests even at reduced profit margins, while others clung to their premium pricing, betting that their most loyal wealthy clientele would eventually return once economic conditions improved. Neither strategy fully protected against the sheer scale of the economic collapse unfolding across the entire country throughout the early 1930s. The social rituals that had defined the grand hotel experience gradually faded alongside this economic decline. Formal dinners requiring elaborate multi-course service became less common as both guest demand and hotel budgets contracted. Ballroom orchestras, once a significant point of competitive pride between rival hotels, were reduced or eliminated entirely at many establishments unable to justify the considerable expense. The elaborate tipping economy that had sustained so many staff members' actual livelihoods contracted sharply as guests themselves faced tighter financial circumstances and simply had less to give. Some grand hotels did not survive this period at all, closing permanently or being repurposed entirely for other uses, as the extended economic hardship of the Depression stretched across the following decade. Others survived, but in a diminished form, never quite recapturing the particular scale and extravagance that had defined their operation during the previous golden decade. A select few of the most prestigious establishments, particularly in the largest cities, managed to weather the storm relatively intact, their reputation and loyal wealthy clientele sufficient to sustain at least a reduced version of their former grandeur. Some of these grand old hotels remaining recognizable landmarks even today, carrying within their walls the physical memory of that particular vanished decade. And so we return, finally, to where we began, to you, a weary traveler stepping off a long train, wondering what awaited behind those grand doors. You now know. You know about the doorman standing in all weather, remembering every face. You know about the room clerk's silent, instant judgment, and the heavy brass key that never quite left the building's watchful awareness. You know about the bellhop's aching back and his quiet second income arranged discreetly during Prohibition's strange dry years. You know about the elevator operator's practiced hand, and the switchboard operators threading 100 conversations through their headsets each hour. You know about the boilers roaring in the basement, the kitchens working at a furious, invisible pace, the chambermaids folding down beds while their occupants danced 2 floors below. You know, too, about who was welcomed through those doors, and who was permitted only through the service entrance, their own labor building a luxury they would never themselves be allowed to enjoy. You know about the fragile economic bubble underneath all that marble and crystal, and how quickly, when the music finally stopped, the whole elaborate performance began quietly, gradually to fade. And here, at the very end, is the strange and comforting truth worth carrying with you into sleep tonight. Nearly everything that once left those 1920s travelers breathless with wonder is sitting quietly around you right now, in your own ordinary room, entirely unremarked upon. The hot water arrives instantly at your own tap. The light appears the moment your fingers find the switch. Warmth fills your space without a single log needing to be chopped or a single coal needing to be shoveled by anyone, anywhere. Your voice can reach anyone, anywhere in the world in seconds, without a single human operator connecting the call by hand. You are, in every meaningful sense, living inside the very future those exhausted, delighted travelers of 1925 could barely have imagined. So let the marble floors fade, let the chandeliers dim, let the orchestra's last song drift away into silence. You don't need a grand hotel tonight. You already have everything they were so amazed to find. Rest now. Sleep well. Everything has been handled.